All right, Alexander, we are joined here with the great Robert Barnes. How are you doing, Mr. Barnes? Where can people find you? Where can people look up your content? And then let's get into the video straight away, Robert, and let's talk about the Geneva Summit. Let's talk about how you saw things, Putin, Biden, and what do you think is next going forward? So, Mr. Barnes, the floor is yours. And then, Alexander, jump in, and I'll let you two brilliant lawyers just talk about how you saw things.
Sure. So, yeah, people can find me at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. That's where all the exclusive content is going to be. I thought the only explanation that makes sense to me is what you guys have been talking about, which is that this conference Biden was kind of a figurehead, fig leaf, not really. It wasn't really for him. And even some of the national security establishment here that's unhappy with how this conference is going. There was an article, I think, a couple of days ago that basically the only thing that makes sense is that this was an arms control Middle East exit package plan, and that really this was just a disguise to have the military people, the national security people, not even the diplomatic people, meet behind the scenes in person to map out how the U.S. is going to extract itself from Syria. Biden, of course, mistakenly kept calling it Libya, but you could consider those our policies there indistinguishable at times. But and then in the same capacity, to deal with the arms issues that have amazingly been suppressed, at least in terms of the Poseidon weapons system and things like that. Other than Duran and a few military people who just follow military information, there's been almost no discussion about it. And I assume it's because they don't want it publicly discussed that this is their focal point on the U.S. side of the aisle. But there was a lot of arms control discussions that at least came out that we heard about. We didn't hear the details of it, but that's the only logic I could see to this, because otherwise it was just an opportunity for Biden to look bad. There was no way to win this PR-wise. There was a real shift. I mean, when you have the national security establishment here in town whining in D.C. about the fact that over the last 45 days, there has been a clear shift in U.S. policy, at least publicly, towards Russia. My take is that the only thing that makes sense of this summit is that they had real concerns over weapons that changed their perspective, and that they really have decided to exit Afghanistan and the Mideast and leave that part of the Obama legacy behind, and that they need Russia to help facilitate that in terms of its on-the-ground practicalities. So I think that explanation is the only thing to me that makes sense from this conference, because otherwise it was a policy wash and a PR loss for the Biden administration.
Can I just say, I mean, which goes directly to the point that you made, Robert, which is that the one actual statement that they issued, which was on strategic arms, the most interesting thing in it for me was that it also spoke not about just negotiations, setting up a dialogue to talk about strategic arms. It talked about information exchange. It talked about getting to understand better what each side is doing. And I think that's absolutely essential, because we are losing control of the arms race, and we have these new weapon systems that are coming, especially out of Russia, which I have to say look to me both extremely frightening and extremely destabilizing. There was the Poseidon submarine drone, which you talked about. There's this new hypersonic glide vehicle. There's all of these things that are happening, and we do need either to cap them, that would be ideal, or even better, to stop them, but also to find some way, if we can't do those things, to understand what each side, because the US is sooner or later going to develop analogous weapons, what each side proposes to do with them and how it might use them and what its red lines in relation to these weapons might be. And I think that's essential, and I can completely understand why the Pentagon especially would be really concerned about this and would be saying to the President and to the White House, we've got to have an open discussion about this, because otherwise we could be looking at a very dangerous situation indeed. So I think that is a very good thing. Now, about the Middle East, I'm not so sure, to be frank, in the sense that I think the Middle East policy is still a work in progress. I think the direction of travel is definitely to try and quit. I don't think they've really worked out how to do it. And maybe they did talk about it with Putin a bit, But what he can do, I'm not really sure, to be straightforward about it. In Syria, perhaps he can do something. Afghanistan, I don't think the Russians want to go back to Afghanistan for all sorts of reasons. But if they do want to quit the Middle East, good. That's the first thing to say. But they've got to be clear-headed about how they go about that. And I'm not sure at the moment they are.
Robert, why is the media not talking about the weapons side of things, and they're focusing on ridiculous stuff like Navalny and things like that? What's the reasoning, in your opinion?
My assumption is that the U.S. doesn't want it talked about, and so they're not leaking to anybody, they're not directing anybody, and our media are they're such young kids that that they really don't, and they don't follow independent sources. I mean, they're almost stenographers for the deep state apparatus these days, so that they think they're something special because they have an intelligence agency source. And I assume that's it, because it's just been intriguing to me how there was a clear sudden shift in Biden policy, at least rhetorically and publicly, towards Russia, that's followed up by this need for this summit, in which nobody could figure out what the summit was about, why it was being rushed, why the traditional diplomatic chain wasn't being met. And then you had that national security establishment piece saying that this summit doesn't make sense, and the summit is counterproductive from the Atlanticists, their perspective. And so my assumption is that they are truly bothered by the weapon system development, and they just don't want anybody to talk about. They think it would make the U.S. look weak to say we want to sort of put a halt, to do something to deal with this. That at least the military press here did not anticipate this weapon system actually being developed. And for those that don't know, I mean, you're talking about nuclear drones that can submarine drone that can set off tsunamis. Yeah. And I do enjoy the occasional Russian defense that these are defensive weapons, but unless their goal is to create a moat around Moscow by doing something in the sea, these are offensive weapons. They might have a deterrent value, quote unquote, and it may have worked for Putin's benefit if in fact this was the motivation of it. And it wouldn't. And the Russians always play the diplomatic game straight under Putin. I mean, they don't leak things in problematic ways. They don't try to upstage anybody. They try to do things by the book. Now, I'll give Putin credit for sitting down with the guy who's most well known as a open CIA asset for NBC News. I mean, I think he's been outed 3 times in the last 3 years. It was a funny that Putin chose him was obviously a wink and a nod to who the guy really is. Now, he didn't help himself in his questioning, of course. More embarrassment. Started off with that crackpot theory about Iran satellites, and Putin got to spend much of the interview laughing. But I mean, it was good for the Russian audience. I mean, because he had this deep state hack putting out the deep state perspective. And the Russian audience gets to see that side of U.S. media, which just reinforces Putin's popularity in his own country. And I thought otherwise the press conference was what you guys predicted it would be. I mean, these people were so excited. They were finally standing up to Hitler and Stalin, and they get all ready to ask their questions. And then they just keep asking the same questions, even when Putin's already answered them previously. And then they're completely unprepared to follow up on any of the answers because they don't know basic facts. I mean, aside from this is just all hysteria, a lot of their allegations and attacks on Putin, but stuff like cyber crimes. It always reminds me of like when I'm traveling around the world dealing with tax loopholes or tax shelters and tax havens. The rest of the world mostly laughs because the U.S. is one of the top tax havens for the rest of the world. That's why Delaware corporations are what they are. The same with cyber crimes. I mean, anybody in the IT space knows the U.S. is the leading geographic location for cyber crimes. And Putin's ability of just to have that data right off the top of his head is always extraordinary. And the number of information requests that Russia has granted for Russia cyber criminal suspects and the U.S. has not. And so it seemed like it was a show to make it look like Biden was being tough and doing all of that, but that really something else was happening behind the scenes, and that and the fact that military people were the key people there, national security people, told me that was the focus. And the only 2 explanations that make sense there, because the whole anti-China thing's not going to go anywhere with Russia at this point, would be either the Middle East or the arms, strategic arms. And I got on the Middle East just because Biden can't help himself when he started. A day or 2 before, the first place he went when they asked him about the upcoming summit was kept calling it Libya, but was getting out of Syria. He's like, well, he could help us. And he's like, oh, I shouldn't negotiate. What he really meant to say is I shouldn't be saying this out loud. But that's Joe. That's my take, is that the untold story is the only story about this summit that makes any strategic sense that I can see.
Alexander, is the game plan for Russia offensive? I mean, Putin hasn't hidden the fact, guys, that Russia has these weapons. I mean, we've had complete, computer generated videos on these weapons, and he's sat in front of 100 people saying, "Here they are, guys. Here they are, and here's the damage they can do." These aren't like hidden away tapes or anything or videos. These are out in the open.
No, which tells you two things. Firstly, they're partly serving, let's straightforwardly say it, a propaganda purpose. They reassure the Russian people, or if you like, tell the Russian people we are a major power. But they also have another purpose, and I think this is what they're really all about. And this is what I hope they are all about, which is to gain leverage over the United States, because they are offensive weapons directed at the United States. Just as Robert said, they can do terrible things to the United States. And by the way, I don't buy the idea, the story, that they are second, that they are the sort of weapons you launch after you've suffered already a first strike. It seems to me that what they're there for is to scare. Firstly, so you scare the Americans into negotiations, or if that doesn't work and you find yourself in a crisis, then you deploy them in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, and you say, well, I'm ready to launch these things unless I get concessions from you. So I think that's what they are. I think they are basically, from the Russian point of view, exercises in obtaining diplomatic and political leverage over the US. And if Robert is right, that this is partly what the summit was all about, from a Russian point of view, they will have achieved that purpose. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work to eliminate these things. They are inherently extremely dangerous and profoundly destabilizing. I would add one other thing. Yes, there were the military people there from the US, but the interesting thing was one of the people who came to the summit with Putin was the chief of the general staff, General Gerasimov. So it shows that the Russian military are also involved in this talk also, and that goes very much to support the take that Robert was making.
So, Robert, where do we go from here? I mean, we had the Biden press conference. We saw what the media is focused on. Where do we really go from here? Where does the U.S. really go from here with regards to these weapons and dealing with Russia? Are we going to get more fluff, more ridiculous Putin's a dictator stories, more sanctions, removal from SWIFT? Meanwhile, you have these weapon systems sitting out there ready to, as Alexander says, gain leverage over the U.S.
I mean, I think Alexander's right. I think that Putin gamed this correctly. And here, the paranoia about Putin in certain aspects of the national security establishment play to his favor. Because if you think he's part crazy, if you think he's part empire-driven, if you think these sort of myths about him, well, that plays into the leverage that these weapon systems present. I don't think we're going to see an acceleration of Russian sanctions, because I was totally startled by what the whole U-turn. I mean, it was always going to be nonsense about they could never stop Nord Stream 2, and that was kind of dumb. And it's unfortunate that Republicans are back to playing Romney 2012 politics. Like, that worked well then, but, they're back to that well again. But putting that aside, I don't see it. It seems like something has seriously, tactically, strategically changed and shifted. And I was curious to watch this, that if there was some big ambush and if there was some big grandstanding by Putin, then by Biden at the Putin summit, then I might have shifted. But when that didn't happen, when it all seemed to confirm that something is going on behind the scenes that has the U.S. shifting strategies. I mean, the explanation of the national security establishment is the desire to shift to China, but I don't think that at least wasn't their goal out of the gate. I mean, they want to deal with China, but they're obsessively anti-Russian. They've built 6 years into this now, into building up this sort of myth of bad Putin and the world's worst leader. And that's why the media is so eager for it, and they didn't understand why they didn't get it. And then they were annoyed by it, and that's why the questioning happening. So I don't think there'll be an acceleration, at least for the next 6 months, especially, put it this way. If nothing happens over the next 6 months that accelerates, that means something is behind the scenes happened that has shifted their direction, because that was where the goal was going.
Yeah.
But I think, because they also did the U-turn on everything. On Ukraine, I mean, basically Biden threw Ukraine under the bus again. I don't know why, the Ukraine leader thought that playing ball with the West somehow was going to magically bring the fairy dust to town for what is now the poorest country in Europe, I believe. Ukraine never has recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union, unlike other countries did. And the EU myth has never been the attraction they thought it could be. But he just summarily, you had people here deeply involved in the Ukraine coup, just completely all of a sudden, they just abandoned Ukraine overnight. I mean, it was a major shift. It was, we're ready to go to war, to not only are we turning around our ships, screw you, you need to fix your own government and you're just a bunch of corrupt hacks anyway. I mean, that was a radical reversal, given the Biden administration's own, Biden family's unique history in Ukraine as well. But so given all that, I think that Putin, if this thesis is right, then there won't be an acceleration of sanctions towards Russia over the next 6 months, and there'll be a shift towards other regions in the world. They're also worried domestically because Biden's poll number ratings are dropping, and they're not going to get through any of their domestic policy agenda, and I think that will influence what they do in the foreign policy arena. In other words, they'll try to either make up for or substitute for domestic problems, potentially with some foreign policy crisis, but I think they'll stay away from that being Europe and Russia for the time being.
Alexander, Robert is hitting our timeline exactly as we called it in the video that we did. We said 3 to 6 months, Robert. We said 3 to 6 months, and we said most likely something swift, sanctions will come. If it doesn't come by then Robert is 100% right. I would imagine that they're scared. They're scared to death of what Russia's developing here.
Well, scared to death, I think, maybe overstating it, but at least they are changing changing the direction of their policy. I just want to say something about China, because I had thought, and I think a lot of people had, that this was actually part of this great plan, was to sort of get the Russians to sort of distance themselves from China and to pivot away. And I'm going to say something else. I think the Chinese were worried that might actually happen. There's been a whole flood of articles in the Chinese media over the last 3 weeks, ever since the summit was announced, actually, going on and on about how, the Russian-Chinese friendship is now unbreakable, indivisible, all the rest, which when you see that there is so much pouring out, that suggests actually that they're not completely sure. And I was expecting more of it. And I was a little surprised. In fact, I was really surprised that didn't happen, that China doesn't seem to have played any role in this summit meeting at all. And I just find that a bit surprising, because I would have thought that from a cold-blooded, rational, cool, logical point of view, that's perhaps what the US ought to be doing. So again, I wonder why that wasn't quite, why that didn't happen exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I could keep coming back to the weapons system. It's the only thing I could see, and to some degree trying to extract from the Mideast, because maybe I didn't think they were sincere about that, but maybe they are. I didn't think they would really get out of Afghanistan, and now it looks like maybe we are. But yeah, it's the only explanation, because otherwise nothing else makes sense of this, other than it is true there's sort of chaotic. What they accuse the Trump foreign policy of being is what the Biden administration foreign policy is. You have a bunch of people, a bunch of cooks in the kitchen with completely contrary agendas that cannot get along, and that is a potential explanation for these events. But the most persuasive one I know so far is this, particularly because China didn't even get publicly discussed much, and they didn't make any inroads on. If China was the goal, then it was a complete failure all the way across Europe, because they got a few light statements, and that was it. It was not the achievement. If that was the goal, I think something else was the objective, and then everything else was like a smokescreen to disguise what the real objective was. Is my initial takeaway from all this. It's the only thing that makes sense out of it. Otherwise,
yeah. Well, I have to say, Robert. I mean, if your assessment is correct, then it's a hopeful sign. Hopeful sign from I think from a point of view of someone who lives in Europe, that, you know, a certain easing in tensions is a good idea. A hopeful sign in that if you start to get some kind of cooling of relations with Russia, maybe, just maybe, that will cool things a bit in the US also, because Russia has now become such a domestic issue in the US, and in such a bad way, in my opinion. I don't mean the real country. I mean the sort of myth of Russia that is conjured up now, especially to sort of use against some people like, well, Donald Trump and people like that. But also, if we can actually start to move forward to some control on strategic arms and to dealing with these weapons, well, that would be an entirely good thing. It's just that I do wonder whether we'll get there at the end of this 6 months, because so much could go wrong in the meantime.
Robert and Alexander, to wrap it up. Robert, what about the neocons? Well, they won't let this fly. Whether it's Biden, whether it's Trump, it doesn't matter. They're not going to let any type of rapprochement with Russia occur on any level. What do you make of the neocon wing in the U.S. government? How are they going to look at this summit?
I think two things are happening. Sort of what I call the neoliberal wing that is baffled. That they seem to have no understanding of what's going on, like that piece that we referenced where they're like, this is a disaster. How could this be happening? So on and so forth. And then the neocon, you know, Pompeo is really representing them. He's sort of disguised himself as a Trump supporting person, but he's not if you look at his politics. Hannity has been beating the anti-Russia drum. They're back to the 2012, you know, Romney-style politics towards Russia. They'll play Biden week. That will be their popular angle on this, on the conference. But I just don't, I mean, one, they don't understand that people have never been there. I mean, the more peace-oriented person and the more reconciliation-oriented candidate has won almost every time other than 2020, and Biden's positions were kind of inconsistent and milquetoast during the campaign. And so I don't think there's politics, but I think that's how, I don't know if there's enough there. If they can't get this administration to pump up a anti-Russia hysteria, then in my view, it's dead. I mean, it's not, because there isn't much, there's only momentum within the intellectual and professional and media classes. There's none within the actual voting base of the country. So I think Putin now amongst Republicans is the most popular foreign leader outside of one or two people, maybe. He's still unpopular net, but he went from like 2% approval to 20% approval because of Trump. And so I don't see that changing anytime soon. So I think the political momentum for Russia bashing has been gone for a while, but this summit kind of proved that. But outside of the media and establishment classes, who are clearly just going to keep hitting the drum as loud and as hard as they can, but I think to lesser and lesser results.
I'm going to just add one thing to all of this, which is that, of course, if there is a shift in the US policy, it's going to have a very big effect in some countries in Europe, Britain being one. Our political class has invested massively in the whole anti-Russia policy and anti-Russian narrative. And if we find ourselves in a situation where the US is going in a different direction, and where, of course, the Germans have never really been on board with our sort of direction, we're going to look very isolated. And we need to start rethinking our own policies about this too, and perhaps working out more carefully what we should be doing, because this isn't something that the British expected at all, and the British are not happy about this. They weren't happy about the fact that Biden is pulling out of Afghanistan, or seeming to. They're not happy about the fact that he didn't send the warships to the Black Sea. They're even more strident. They're much more strident about supporting Ukraine than the US is. So from their point of view, this is going to be a difficult thing to understand and to digest. And if you look at the coverage of the summit here in Britain, you can actually get a sense of that unease that is beginning to grow, and which starts to worry lots of people. Well, all I will say about that is that I always felt that Donald Trump, sorry to bring him up, was a potential friend of Britain. I never thought the same about Biden. The British disliked Donald Trump. They wanted Biden to win. Here's a classic case of be careful what you wish for.
All right, guys, final question. One last question. Robert, Alexander, the summit is wrapped up. It's in the books. What does Biden focus on now? What do you think the Biden White House focuses on now?
He's got, well, I mean, he really needs to, from a foreign policy perspective, I assume it would be to shift to China and accelerate and find whatever issues they do. They can't seem to settle on their issues. I mean, are they going to focus on something domestic like Uyghurs in Hong Kong? Are they going to focus on something more military oriented like the South China Sea or North Korea, the development in China's relationship related there too, or economics on trade, where he has, now it looks like they are partially going to use the lab leak hypothesis as political leverage against China, but he hasn't, stepped up. He just allowed it out, but then hasn't taken a second step. So, and I think there's a lot of internal chaos, and you're seeing more criticism of him from within the liberal press of saying, his popularity is, the only reason he's there instead of Kamala is that Kamala's seen as hated and so couldn't get anything done. But if Biden can't get anything through domestically and can't impress at any level internationally, we may see an acceleration of the Kamala Harris plan. And if we start seeing negative stories leak about Biden's family, that maybe they've accelerated the investigation, that kind of thing, that means the move is out to push him out. But we'll see. Otherwise, he's really in poor shape right now, both domestically and internationally on the political stage.
Hunter the artist, guys. Hunter the artist. Alexander, wrap it up.
No, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, if you want me to say what I think he should do, I think he should work to try and bring his domestic policy back into touch with reality. That's where I think the real problems and the real dangers are. I think that part of the reason he's failing politically is because his domestic policy is completely unrealistic. And I think that if he were to do that, then we might see the situation stabilize. But then, of course, that would create a whole host of other problems with other people in the Democratic Party who are not just not in touch with reality, but who live in a completely different reality. But I still think that's what Biden should do. He should start behaving like the president he actually said he would be, which is, this conciliatory, centrist president, which, of course, he's not. And he should also try, it seems to me, to work out an economic policy that is more, frankly, realistic again. I mean, or rather more relates to the real issues, the real problems which exist in the United States. And if he does that, if he were to do that, I'm being extremely unrealistic now, but if he were to do that, and if this was done on a sustained basis, I think what you would very quickly find is, firstly, that an American government, a US government that did that would become popular, and secondly, that the US, its international position would very quickly start to improve, because it's the problems that people see from outside in the US itself that are what causes a lot of people around the world to be extremely uncertain about where the US is going. But that's my own take on this.
All right, guys, we will leave it there. Alexander Berkhurst, thank you very much. And the great Robert Barnes, thank you very much for joining us. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure to have you with us. Once again, where can people find you? I'm going to put all your links in the description box down below as well. But one more time, where can people find you, Mr. Barnes?
Sure, the best place is vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
Everything will be down below. Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.